Okay, so you have looked at the previous YouTube video, right? Talking about some problems with the commercial human ancestry test kit. Okay, the commercial test kit does not specifically use the mitochondrial DNA or the Y chromosome, right? It just uses the entire genome and look for some of the differences. So for the human genographic project, right, it specifically uses the mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosome, and that is advantageous, right, over the use of the rest of the autosomal DNA, because if you look at the autosomal DNA, right, the inheritance of the chromosomes from either parent, right, is only half, and that is not considering the phenomenon of crossing over, right? So if you take a look at this diagram, right, which you are very familiar with, in meiosis, right? Okay, so the child would only inherit like half of the father's DNA and half of the mother's DNA, and in terms of the DNA sequence or in terms of the chromosome itself, right? It would be identical to half of the father's chromosomes and half of the mother chromosomes if there's no crossing over. But with crossing over, right, the differences is even more. And so you can imagine, right, if a father's gene, right, is found on this, let's say not gene, a particular locus, let's say, is found on this part of the chromosome, right, the child would only obtain half of it, right? And imagine there's another marker, right, another locus that's found on the same chromosome but at the other end, right? If there's a crossing over, then the child would have like a different combination of the genetic markers, right? So the differences between just one generation, not only is it halved, right, in terms of the kinds of genetic markers that the child might have compared to the parents, the combination of markers might change even more, right, because of crossing over. Right, so if you consider that and then you go down the generations, right, the differences will be smaller and smaller and smaller, just going like back for a few generations. Right, so the similarities between the child or the current generation and just a few generations back would be so small that it is not conclusive whether they are of the same lineage or not. Right, so using the autosomal DNA, right, or it would not be able to allow us to chase the ancestry for a very long history. Okay, so we have to use the mitochondrial DNA and the Y chromosome because there's no problem in terms of halving, right, in terms of inheritance, right? The mitochondrial DNA, the entire piece of mitochondrial DNA would be inherited from the mother to the child, okay? Because you inherit the entire mitochondria in the egg, right? And there will be a few mitochondria. Oh, so there is like no halving of, like, there's no meiosis, right, for mitochondria, so there's no halving of the mitochondrial DNA content. Same for the Y chromosome because the father only has one Y chromosome, right? So there's no like halving in terms of the Y chromosome itself, right, from the father to the son. Okay, and of course there's no crossing over either, right? The problem of crossing over and changing the combinations of genetic markers, right? There's no crossing over for mitochondrial DNA, and the Y chromosome and the X chromosome, they are not similar, right? They are two different chromosomes, so they don't really pair up and cross over like the other autosomal chromosomes, which do have a pair, right? And they can form the bivalent and do the crossing over. Right, so for the X and Y chromosome, they don't really pair up and cross over like the other autosomal chromosomes. Right, so there's no crossing over, no changing of the genetic markers in terms of the combination of markers as well, right? So another advantage, right, for the mitochondrial DNA and the Y chromosome is in terms of the inheritance, right? The mitochondrial DNA is only inherited from the mother to the child, right? So I can trace the maternal line. And for the Y chromosome, only from the father to the son, right? So I can trace the paternal line, right? So using the particular types of DNA, right, whether it's mitochondrial DNA or Y chromosome, I can trace just one parent, right? So which in many cases really, right? Together with other evidences, it complements or it play a big role, okay? Because other evidences in terms of say the anatomical, in terms of the archaeological, right, wouldn't be able to differentiate the sex in most cases, right? So to use DNA, and which allow us to even differentiate between the sexes, right, would be a great complement over the other, or together with the other types of evidences. All right, and there is this concept, right, of mitochondrial Eve and the Y chromosomal Adam, which are defined as the most common maternal or paternal ancestor for all the currently living humans, or currently living men. All right, but you will need to take note of the fact that this concept, right, this mitochondrial Eve and Y chromosomal Adam is really not one person or a pair of people, right? The identity of these Eve and Adam would change when the currently living humans change. Like for example, if tomorrow I die, touch wood, right, then there would be one less man in the currently living set of men, right? So with one less man, the currently living men would change, and if that change, then the most common ancestor might change, right? So just take note of this concept when we look at the inheritance of the mitochondrial DNA. Obviously, we can trace all the way back to like the most common ancestor for all the living humans. And when we trace the Y chromosome, the inheritance of the Y chromosome, obviously we can trace back to the Y chromosomal Adam, right, which is the most recent common ancestor for all the men, right? But the most recent common ancestor would change, right, depending on the currently living population. All right, so it's not really Adam and Eve like in the Bible, right? They are not really one person or one female and one male. Yeah, they are like the most recent common ancestor for who are currently living. Okay, so just this concept when we look at the inheritance of mitochondrial DNA and the Y chromosome. All right.